October 1969. The North Atlantic. 400 feet beneath the storm-whipped surface. The world is reduced to a low-frequency rumble and the faint, metallic sighs of a pressurized hull. Inside the attack submarine USS Sturgeon, the atmosphere is not one of explosive tension, but of profound, focused stillness. The control room is bathed in dim red light. Men speak in whispers, if they speak at all. Their eyes are locked on waterfall displays, cascading sheets of green light that paint sound as geometry. On the passive sonar, a rhythm pulses through the deep. Swish, thump, swish, thump. It is the acoustic signature of a Soviet Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine. A vessel capable of ending cities. It is less than 4,000 yards ahead. Commander, later Vice Admiral, John McKee has just executed a maneuver of breathtaking audacity. For 47 hours, the Sturgeon has been silently, methodically, closing the distance. Not to attack, but to observe. To become a phantom in the Yankees' baffles, the sonar blind spot directly behind its screw. The Sturgeon is now so close that the Soviet boat's propeller noises mask the American submarine's own minimal sounds. One wrong move, a dropped tool, a sudden depth change, a transient noise, and the ghost becomes a target. The Soviet admiral commanding the Red Banner Northern Fleet has no idea that his most precious strategic asset, a submarine carrying 16 nuclear warheads, has acquired a permanent, invisible shadow. In this moment, the Cold War is not fought with rhetoric or missiles, but with hydrophones, patience, and steel nerves in the absolute dark. This was not an act of war, but of supreme espionage. And it was the culmination of a silent doctrine born from the ashes of a world war that had redefined the very nature of the deep. To understand the silent stalkers of the Cold War, one must first journey back to the dying days of the Third Reich. By early 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic had been decisively lost by Germany. The once terrifying U-boat wolf packs were being slaughtered by Allied convoy escorts equipped with advanced radar, high-frequency direction finding, HF/DF, and sonar. The ocean had become a transparent grave for the Kriegsmarine. But in the Baltic shipyards of Hamburg, Bremen, and Danzig, a revolution was taking shape beneath camouflage netting and bombing rubble. This was the Type XXI Electroboot, the world's first true submarine. Previous vessels, including American and British designs, were essentially surface ships that could submerge for brief periods. They were submersibles. The Type XXI was designed to live underwater. Its innovations were transformative. A streamlined, hydrodynamic hull, tested in wind tunnels, allowed for unprecedented underwater speed, over 17 knots, faster than many contemporary surface escorts could manage while hunting. It was equipped with a snorkel, mast, allowing its diesel engines to run at periscope depth, charging batteries without fully surfacing. Its most terrifying feature, however, was silence. Rubber-coated decking, quiet electric motors, and specially mounted machinery were designed to make it acoustically invisible. It could fire a full salvo of 6 torpedoes from its bow tubes in under 20 seconds using a primitive computer system, all while lurking at depths previously unreachable. The Type XXI arrived too late to change the tide of war. Only a handful saw combat, and their impact was negligible. But when Allied technical intelligence teams, part of Operation Paperclip and its British equivalents, crawled over the captured hulls in Wilhelmshaven and Bremerhaven in May 1945, they experienced a profound shock. Every Allied submarine in service was instantly obsolete. Naval architect Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, the future father of the nuclear navy, would later state the Type XXI represented a quantum leap, as great a change in submarine design as the shift from sail to steam. The United States and Soviet Union, uneasy allies at best, both seized the prize. The U.S. Navy took U-2513, which President Harry S. Truman would famously ride on a submerged demonstration. The Soviets claimed several hulls, designating them as Project 614. Each superpower meticulously reverse-engineered the German Ghost. For the Americans, it was a template for evolution. For the Soviets, it was the foundational blueprint for a massive, modern submarine fleet. The seeds of the coming underwater confrontation were sown not in 1947, but in the captured, futuristic hulls of 1945. This technological shockwave set the stage, but the geopolitical landscape was shifting with even greater force, creating a mission for which the silent submarine would become the perfect, and only, instrument. The post-war world fractured swiftly. The Iron Curtain descended not just across Europe, but across the oceans. By the late 1950s, the nature of the ultimate strategic threat had been utterly transformed. It was no longer fleets of bombers that defined the balance of terror, but the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, ICBM. And the most survivable, frighteningly undetectable launch platform for these weapons was not a silo or an airfield, but a submarine. The Soviet Union, under the driven leadership of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, embarked on a shipbuilding program of staggering scale. Gorshkov's philosophy was blunt: to counter American naval and nuclear superiority, the USSR would create a massive, global submarine force designed to threaten the enemy's homeland in sea lines of communication. First came diesel-electric boats like the Zulu class, modified to launch ballistic missiles. Then, harnessing captured German technology and their own engineering, they launched the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, the K-3 Leninskaya Komsomol, in 1958. This was followed by the Hotel-class nuclear ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs. For the United States, this posed an existential intelligence crisis. Where were these Soviet submarines built? How fast were they? How deep could they dive? But most critically, how loud were they? A submarine's acoustic signature is its fingerprint. Knowing that fingerprint allows you to track it, identify it, and if necessary, kill it in a time of war. Without it, the Soviet SSBN fleet was an invisible, moving doomsday weapon. Satellite imagery could show shipyards, but not secrets of machinery. Electronic intercepts could catch communications, but not the sound of a propeller shaft. The U.S. Navy's answer was born of desperation and ingenuity. It was called the Hunter-Killer mission, and it would evolve into something far more subtle, the silent trail. The concept was deceptively simple, astronomically difficult: use America's own superior submarine technology to covertly find, follow, and meticulously record a Soviet submarine during its normal operations. This was not a one-time surveillance snap. It was a long-term, intimate study. The goal was to map the target's entire acoustic profile, its sounds at different speeds, its reactor pump harmonics, its screw cavitation noises, and to observe its tactics, its patrol routes, its crew discipline. To execute this, the U.S. needed a vessel that didn't just improve on the Type XXI, but transcended it. It needed a submarine that wasn't merely quiet, but virtually anechoic, a black hole in the ocean. The mission demanded a technological leap so profound it would give the Americans an advantage the Soviet admirals could not comprehend, because they could not hear it coming. This pursuit of acoustic superiority would become the defining arms race of the deep, a race the Soviets, for decades, did not even know they were losing. The United States did not merely want a new submarine, it needed to redefine the physical principles of stealth in a watery medium. The path to the perfect trailing platform began not with weapons, but with a pure hydrodynamic experiment, the USS Albacore, AGSS 569. Launched in 1953, Albacore was a radical departure. It looked like a blimp or a teardrop, a body of revolution. It had no traditional deck gun, no protruding conning tower in the classic sense. This shape, tested through thousands of hours of model runs, offered radically reduced hydrodynamic drag and noise. Albacore was the wind tunnel model for everything that followed. The first production submarines to harness these lessons were the Thresher class, later Permit class, nuclear attack submarines. Their design mantra was quieting above all else. Every system was scrutinized not for power, but for sound. Turbines and reduction gears, the traditional shriekers of a nuclear plant, were mounted on massive, sound-dampening rafts suspended from the hull, floating floors for machinery. Pumps, the circulatory system of the boat, were designed for low vibration. The hull itself was coated in anechoic tiles, rubberized sheets filled with resonant voids that absorbed active sonar pings and dampened internal noise. But the true masterpiece of this era was the Sturgeon class. If the Thresher was a prototype of quieting, the Sturgeon was its perfected production model. Longer, with a more refined version of the teardrop hull, it was explicitly designed for the clandestine mission profile, intelligence collection and trailing operations. Its diving planes were moved from the sail to the bow, reducing flow noise. Its reactor was a natural circulation model at low speeds, meaning the cooling water could flow by convection, eliminating the need for noisy pump motors entirely when creeping along at trail speed. The result was a profound acoustic asymmetry. By the mid-1960s, an American Sturgeon-class submarine running at 5 knots was quieter than the ambient background noise of the ocean itself, the sound of waves, rain, and shrimp. A Soviet submarine of the same era, designed with a focus on surface speed, rugged construction, and heavy missile armament, would sound, on American hydrophones, like a cacophonous symphony of grinding machinery. This was the cornerstone of the entire endeavor. The Soviet admirals operated under the assumption that the deep ocean was a dark, hiding place. The Americans had turned it into a well-lit auditorium, where they sat in a soundproof booth, listening to every move their opponent made. The technological marvel was nothing without the men who operated it. A trailing mission was a psychological and physiological marathon, often lasting 60 to 90 days submerged, with no sunlight, no fresh air, and the constant, low-grade terror of discovery. This was not the dramatic hunter-killer patrol of wartime lore, it was a state of sustained, excruciating tension. The crew was handpicked for temperament as much as skill. Boisterous personalities were a liability. The ideal officer or sonarman was calm, meticulous, and capable of enduring monotony without losing edge. They lived under a doctrine of ultra-quiet. When trailing a Soviet boomer, all non-essential machinery was secured. Crewmen moved in socked feet. Tools were pre-wrapped in foam. Meals were planned to avoid the clatter of pots and pans. Conversations were hushed. A sneeze could be considered a major incident. The submarine became a monastic order dedicated to the religion of silence. The control room during a close trail was a temple to this focus. The sonar operators, the gears of the boat, wore headphones constantly, their world defined by the rhythmic swish thump of the target's propeller. They learned to distinguish every squeal and rumble, to notice the slightest change in pitch that might indicate the Soviet sub was altering depth or speed. The fire control tracking party plotted the target's course, speed, and bearing with obsessive precision, creating a solution not for torpedo firing, but for station keeping. The officer of the deck and the captain made infinitesimal adjustments to speed and rudder, flying the submarine in a three-dimensional dance mere hundreds of yards behind an oblivious giant. The pressure was omnipresent. A collision was a very real possibility. So was detection. Every man knew that if the Soviet submarine suddenly turned and accelerated, it could mean they had been spotted. The rules of engagement in these uncharted waters were vague. They were in international waters, but so deep in the enemy's operational area that a violent response was a constant specter. The stress forged a unique bond, but it also took a toll. Sleep was fractured by watch schedules. The recycled air grew thick with the smell of machine oil, sweat, and ozone. They were ghosts in the machine, their entire existence bent towards a single purpose, to remain an unseen, unheard shadow for one more hour, one more day. Their success was measured not in explosions, but in the uneventful accumulation of acoustic tapes and photographic film. To understand the profound success of the American trailing operations, one must examine the quarry. The Soviet Navy of Admiral Gorshkov was a force engineered for a specific, devastating wartime mission, a massive, simultaneous strike against NATO carrier groups and coastal targets. This strategic imperative bred specific, and ultimately vulnerable, engineering choices. Soviet submarine design prioritized ruggedness, surface speed, for rapid transit to patrol zones, and most of all, firepower. Boats like the Yankee-class SSBNs and Victor-class attack submarines carried formidable arsenals. Their double-hulled construction, with a strong inner pressure hull surrounded by a thinner outer hull, made them incredibly tough and buoyant. But this design created resonant cavities that trapped and amplified internal machinery noise. Their propellers, often with fewer, broader blades, were optimized for thrust and high-speed cavitation, not acoustic discretion. Their turbines and reduction gears were mounted directly to the hull, turning the entire submarine into a giant sounding board. This was not merely an oversight, it was a cultural and industrial artifact. The Soviet military-industrial complex excelled at producing robust, powerful systems. The subtle science of quieting, of vibration analysis, precision machining, and acoustic damping materials, was a lower priority. Soviet naval doctrine also assumed that in a nuclear conflict, stealth was secondary to the ability to launch a first or retaliatory salvo. Detection was a risk to be managed, not an existential parameter to be designed around. Furthermore, the Soviet Navy operated with a distinct psychological posture. It was a bastion navy. Their strategic missile submarines, the crown jewels of the fleet, were expected to patrol in heavily defended sanctuaries, the icy waters of the Arctic near the Soviet coast, or the protected seas like the Barents and the Okhotsk. These were Soviet-dominated waters, thick with their own surface ships, aircraft, and hunter-killer subs. The assumption of safety within these bastions bred a certain operational predictability and, critically, a lack of acute paranoia about covert intruders. Why would an American submarine dare the formidable defenses of the Sea of Okhotsk? The very audacity of the American mission was its shield. Thus, the Soviet submariner sailed in a vessel that, to American hydrophones, announced its presence with a unique, clattering roar. He operated within a doctrinal bubble that, while alert to the threat of attack, fundamentally underestimated the enemy's ability to achieve such intimate, prolonged surveillance. His confidence in the sanctity of his bastion was the very flaw the American Silent Service was engineered to exploit. The clandestine trailing missions were not ad hoc adventures. They were part of a highly classified, meticulously planned program codenamed Operation Holystone, later renamed Ivy Bells when its focus expanded to include cable tapping. Overseen by a joint Navy-NSA-CIA cell, Holystone's objective was granular and immense: to build a comprehensive acoustic library of the entire Soviet fleet. Each trail was a data-gathering bonanza. The primary tool was the boat's BQQ-2 passive sonar suite, an array of hydrophones along the hull that could listen in 360 degrees. For a close trail, the sonar operators weren't just tracking, they were recording. Reels of magnetic tape captured every groan, whine, and thump of the target. Engineers and intelligence specialists aboard, often civilians in flannel, from the Naval Intelligence Support Center, would catalog these sounds, linking specific noises to engine revolutions, reactor pump settings, and hull strains. This created a sound signature for each class, and even for individual boats. In a future war, any Soviet submarine making noise could be instantly identified, tracked, and targeted by any US or NATO platform. But sonar was only one sense. American SSNs were also fitted with periscope-mounted cameras. During carefully timed periscope pop-ups, they would photograph the Soviet submarine's hull, its screw, any unique markings or modifications. These photographs provided visual confirmation of intelligence from other sources and revealed construction details. The most critical data, however, was operational. By trailing a Soviet SSBN for weeks, the Holystone boats mapped its exact patrol patterns, the depth it preferred, its transit routes to and from the Kola Peninsula, its communication schedules, and its crew's proficiency during drills. This allowed U.S. naval intelligence to build predictive models. They could now estimate, with shocking accuracy, how many Soviet ballistic missile submarines were on station at any given time, where they were likely to be, and how they would behave in a crisis. This intelligence directly informed U.S. strategic war plans, allowing for precise targeting and, conversely, enabling arms control negotiators to call Soviet bluffs with hard data. The trailing submarine was more than a spy, it was a mobile, penetrating intelligence platform that peeled back the layers of Soviet naval secrecy one silent mile at a time. The data it brought back was not just tactical, it was strategic gold, recalibrating the entire balance of nuclear deterrence. The trailing operations existed in a legal and ethical gray zone, a shadow realm between peace and war. There were no written treaties governing the silent duel of submarines in international waters. Instead, an unwritten code emerged, a set of deadly serious understandings born of mutual interest in avoiding an apocalyptic incident. The cardinal rule was, do not be detected. For the American trailing boat, detection meant mission failure and potential diplomatic crisis. For the Soviet boat, detection of a phantom stalker would trigger profound shock, operational changes, and a furious hunt. Both sides had an interest in the fiction of the ocean's emptiness. This led to a second, grim understanding: if detected, disengage and vanish. The response to being pinged by active sonar or having a Soviet submarine suddenly turn towards you was not to stand your ground, but to go deep, quiet, and melt away. Confrontation was the ultimate failure. The most feared scenario was the Crazy Ivan. This was the American term for a sudden, radical maneuver by a Soviet submarine, a hard turn, often a full 180-degree sweep, to check its baffles for a trailing enemy. It was a standard Soviet tactic, born of a doctrinal paranoia about American tailing, even if they underestimated its frequency. For the crew of a USS locked in a close trail, a Crazy Ivan was a moment of pure, cold adrenaline. The order would ring out in whispers: Crazy Ivan. Right or left, full rudder. All ahead flank, quiet. The American boat would heave violently to one side, sometimes diving or climbing desperately, to avoid colliding with the suddenly looming hull of its target or being caught in its active sonar beam. Collisions did happen. In March 1968, the USS Sturgeon, SSN 637, reportedly collided with a Soviet Echo II-class submarine in the Barents Sea. Both submarines, badly damaged, limped home. Neither government ever publicly acknowledged the incident. Such events were the car accidents of the Cold War, deniable, hushed up, and a stark reminder of the razor's edge these men walked. They were playing a game of blindman's bluff in 3 dimensions, where a misjudgment of a few yards could mean death, and where the only rule was to never admit the game was being played at all. This delicate, deadly dance set the stage for the most audacious maneuvers of all, not in the open Atlantic, but within the very heart of the Soviet Union's most heavily guarded maritime bastions. The open ocean trails in the Atlantic were intelligence coups, but they operated at the periphery of Soviet power. The true holy grail for Operation Holystone lay within the Soviet bastions, those fortified, interior seas considered inviolable sanctuaries. The greatest of these was the Sea of Okhotsk, a vast, ice-flecked body of water nearly enclosed by Soviet territory, Kamchatka to the east, the Siberian coast to the north, and the heavily fortified Kuril Islands chained to the south. It was here that Soviet Golf II-class diesel-electric ballistic missile submarines, a critical element of their strategic reserve force, conducted their patrols. The Soviet High Command believed the Sea of Okhotsk was impervious to American intrusion. Its narrow straits were monitored by surface ships, aircraft, and listening nets. The water itself was challenging, shallow in many areas, with complex thermal layers that could confound sonar. To the planners at the Pentagon and the NSA, this perceived invulnerability made it the ultimate objective. Penetrating the Sea of Okhotsk would prove that no Soviet maritime space was safe, and the intelligence harvested would be priceless. The mission required a unique boat and a unique commander. The vessel chosen was the USS Halibut, SSN 587. Halibut was a oddity, originally designed as a guided missile submarine to fire the Regulus nuclear cruise missile. With that system obsolete, she had been converted into the Navy's first dedicated intelligence collection platform, a spy sub. She was fitted with a monstrously large bat cave, a flooded hangar in her forward hull that could deploy remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, towed side-scan sonar arrays, and other clandestine gear. She was quiet, she was capable, and she was available. In the autumn of 1968, under the command of Commander John H. Mick McKee, the same officer who would later command the Lapon on its famous trail, Halibut slipped from Pearl Harbor and pointed her bow west. Her transit across the Pacific was an exercise in stealth. She avoided normal shipping lanes. She ran deep. Her crew, augmented by a team of NSA and CIA specialists, was briefed on the extraordinary risk. They were not just going to trail a submarine, they were going to trespass into the very heart of the Soviet Strategic Reserve, a body of water the USSR considered a territorial pond. Navigating the Kuril Islands chain undetected was the first trial. Halibut found a deep channel, slipped past the known Soviet patrols, and entered the Sea of Okhotsk. The atmosphere aboard changed. Here, every contact was a potential threat. Every fishing trawler could be an intelligence gatherer. Every hydrophone effect could be a patrol boat. They were alone, thousands of miles from support, inside the enemy's locked room. And now, they had to find a specific key, a Soviet Golf II, loitering quietly on its battery-powered patrol, believing itself utterly safe. Inside the cold, green expanse of the Sea of Okhotsk, the Halibut began her search. Using her advanced passive sonar, she listened for the distinct acoustic signature of a Golf II, a diesel-electric boat, quieter than a nuclear vessel when on batteries, but still radiating the specific sounds of its pumps, electrical systems, and a uniquely Soviet propeller design. The search was a painstaking process of filtering out the ambient noise of the sea and the distant rumble of Soviet surface traffic. Then, they found it. The faint, rhythmic signature of a submerged submarine, moving at a patrol speed of about 3 knots. It was a Golf II. Commander McKee and his team initiated the silent ballet of the trail. Halibut maneuvered into the submarine's baffles, the sonar blind spot astern. The distance closed, 10,000 yards. 5000. 2000, soon, they were holding a position approximately 1,500 yards behind the Soviet boat, so close that the Golf II's own propeller noise provided acoustic cover for the Halibut's presence. For the next 22 days, the American spy submarine maintained this intimate, invisible leash. It was an unprecedented feat of endurance and nerve. The crew operated under ultra-quiet conditions for weeks on end. They ate cold food to avoid galley noise. Watch sections rotated in near silence. Sonar men became so attuned to their target that they could identify the changing of the watch on the Golf II by subtle shifts in its reactor cooling cycles, when it snorkeled to recharge its batteries. They mapped its daily routine, its patrol box, the proficiency of its crew. Throughout this, the psychological pressure was immense. They were not in the open ocean, they were in a shallow, confined sea. A Crazy Ivan maneuver here would not just risk detection, it could force them into dangerously shallow water or a dead-end bay. Soviet anti-submarine aircraft and surface ships were active overhead and around them. Every pass of a sonobuoy or the ping of a distant active sonar sent a jolt through the boat. They were living inside the Soviet defense network, a mouse sharing a cage with a sleeping bear. The intelligence harvest was monumental. The tapes recorded the Golf II's full acoustic signature across every speed and maneuver. Photographs through the periscope captured detailed images of its hull and propeller. But perhaps the most critical discovery was operational vulnerability. Halibut proved that the Soviet bastion was penetrable. The Golf II crews, operating in what they believed was a secure sanctuary, exhibited a lack of anti-surveillance discipline. They followed predictable patterns. They did not perform aggressive baffle-clearing maneuvers frequently enough. The Sea of Okhotsk was not a fortress, it was a fishbowl, and halibut had just become the unseen observer. The mission culminated not with a dramatic escape, but with a silent withdrawal. Having collected more data than any previous operation, its tapes and film canisters full, halibut carefully disengaged. She slid back through the Kuril Islands Channel, melted into the deep Pacific, and returned to Pearl Harbor. She brought back not just intelligence, but a paradigm-shattering truth: the United States could track the Soviet strategic submarine force anywhere on the globe, even in its most sacred harbors. The balance of power in the deep had just tilted, irrevocably and silently, in America's favor. The Soviet admirals, confident in their bastions, never heard a thing. The tapes and films delivered by halibut and subsequent Holystone missions like Lapons did not simply fill archives, they actively reshaped the military and geopolitical landscape of the Cold War. The intelligence was processed, digitized, and disseminated under the Ocean Surveillance Information System. It became the foundational data set for the U.S. Navy's anti-submarine warfare (ASW) effort. Tactically, the impact was immediate and profound. The unique acoustic signatures of every class of Soviet submarine, and eventually, of individual boats, were loaded into the sonar systems of every U.S. attack submarine, surface ship, and maritime patrol aircraft. A P-3 Orion flying a patrol in the North Atlantic could now drop sonobuoys and, within minutes, identify a contact as a specific Victor III class attack submarine, knowing its maximum depth, speed, and weapon loadout. This transformed ASW from a desperate search for a needle in a haystack into a process of precise identification and tracking. War plans were refined with chilling specificity. The maritime strategy of the 1980s, which called for aggressive forward operations against Soviet bastions, was built on the confidence born from these trails. The U.S. Navy now knew it could hold the Soviet SSBN force at risk from the very beginning of a conflict. Strategically, the advantage was even greater. U.S. arms control negotiators, participating in the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, possessed a secret weapon: unparalleled knowledge of Soviet submarine capabilities and production rates. When Soviet officials made claims about their fleet size or the capabilities of new boats like the Typhoon class, American negotiators could often counter with hard data derived from acoustic trails, calling their bluffs and forcing more verifiable agreements. The intelligence also provided early warning of new Soviet technological developments. The distinctive sound of a new, quieter propeller on a Victor-class submarine, first detected on a trail in 1971, triggered a massive U.S. research program into advanced propeller design, leading to the shrouded, pump-jet, propulsors on later American submarines. The psychological impact within the U.S. national security apparatus was one of immense, but guarded, confidence. A 1978 classified report to the president would state that these operations provided the most important intelligence on the Soviet Union gathered by any means. The Soviet Navy's greatest strategic asset, the secrecy and survivability of its ballistic missile submarine force, had been systematically compromised. For the men in the Pentagon and the White House, the terrifying uncertainty of the hidden enemy had been pushed back by the steady, silent work of the spy submarines. Yet this very success created a vulnerability of its own: the entire edifice depended on one thing: the Soviets remaining in the dark. The fortress of silence was breached not by Soviet sonar, but by human treachery. For over a decade, the holy grail of U.S. submarine espionage remained secure. Then, in 1985, the FBI confronted a retired Navy warrant officer named John Walker. What began as an investigation into his daughter's petty crime unraveled into the most devastating espionage scandal in U.S. naval history. Walker, along with his brother, his son, and a close friend, Jerry Whitworth, had run a spy ring for the KGB for nearly 18 years. Walker, a communications specialist, had never served on a trailing SSN. But he had access to the key cards, the cipher material used to encrypt all naval communications, including the highly classified message traffic to and from Holystone submarines. More catastrophically, his co-conspirator Jerry Whitworth, a Navy radioman, had served aboard the USS Enterprise and had access to a broader range of classified materials. While the full extent of what Walker provided remains partially classified, counterintelligence analysts later concluded that he likely gave the KGB insights into U.S. Navy cryptographic patterns, operational schedules, and possibly reports detailing the capabilities and vulnerabilities of Soviet systems, information that could only have been derived from intimate surveillance. The damage was catastrophic. Although the Soviets may not have received a neatly filed report titled Operation Holystone, the mosaic of data Walker provided allowed them to infer the American capability. They could now re-examine past incidents, unexplained sonar contacts, odd noises in their baffles, the uncanny precision of USASW forces, through a new, horrifying lens. The realization dawned: their bastions were not secure. Their submarines had been followed for years. The Soviet response was swift and twofold. First, they accelerated existing quieting programs, leading to a generational leap in the 1980s with submarines like the Akula-class attack boats, which finally began to approach U.S. acoustic stealth levels. Second, and more immediately, they changed their operational behavior. Patrol routes became less predictable. Crazy Ivan maneuvers became more frequent and erratic. The assumption of sanctuary in the Sea of Okhotsk and the Barents was abandoned, replaced by a new, pervasive paranoia. The window of unparalleled acoustic advantage that the U.S. had enjoyed for nearly 20 years began to slowly close. Yet, the legacy of those silent trails endured. They proved the concept of undersea strategic espionage, a mission profile that continues to this day with even more advanced technology. They provided an intelligence buffer that arguably helped maintain stability during the most tense periods of the Cold War, as U.S. planners operated from a position of knowledge, not fear. And they stand as a testament to a unique blend of human courage and technical ingenuity, a secret war fought not for territory, but for information, where victory was measured in decibels and discretion, and where the greatest triumph was that the enemy never knew they were there, until it was too late. The deep ocean remains the planet's final frontier, not because it is unexplored, but because it is the ideal theater for secrets. The silent war waged by the American submarine service against the Soviet fleet was a conflict of a unique order. It produced no victorious beachheads, no ravaged cities, no monuments etched in stone. Its battlefields were trackless and dark, its victories inscribed on magnetic tape, and its heroes returned with stories they could not tell. This clandestine struggle redefined the meaning of power in the nuclear age. It demonstrated that in an era dominated by the terrifying spectacle of missile launches and megaton blasts, true strategic advantage could be won through the patient, silent accumulation of knowledge. The ability to listen, to track, and to understand the enemy's habits was a form of deterrence more subtle, and perhaps more potent, than the threat of mutual destruction. It replaced the paralysis of fear with the clarity of intelligence. The legacy of those trails echoes in the quiet depths of today's oceans, where a new generation of unseen vessels continues the watch. It serves as a timeless lesson in the nature of technological competition, that an advantage, no matter how profound, is often transient, and that security built on secrecy is inherently fragile. The Soviet admirals never knew they were being followed, until a betrayal reminded both superpowers that human factors, audacity, endurance, and treachery, ultimately govern even the most technically advanced conflicts. In the end, this story is not merely about submarines or surveillance. It is about the profound burden of carrying a nation's most vital secrets in a pressurized steel hull, about the discipline of silence as a weapon, and about the shadowy conflict that unfolded beneath the surface of the Cold War, a conflict whose success was measured not by the explosions it caused, but by the cataclysm it helped to prevent. The men who sailed on those trails held the line not with missiles, but with microphones and nerves of steel, in a silent service whose greatest contribution to history was the war that never happened.